Prakash Shah is a professor of cultural study of law, and let me actually his introduction is very short and brief. The way he presented it, probably out of his humility. Prakash Shah is a reader in culture and law at Queen Mary University of London. He works on law, religion and culture, caste and migration. But I know that apart from these, he is a serious professor of Indic studies also. Indic studies in jurisprudence, Indic studies in Dharma, and he is also deeply impacted by Professor Balu, and he is impacted by the Balu type studies, and he is an editor of a journal also. I saw recently articles published on caste in his journal, in the journal which he edits. Srinivas Garu, could you promote him?
He's already there, sir.
Yeah, okay. So, sir, you were very humble in sending us the introduction. So please mention more things about you before you start speaking. Over to you, Prakash.
Okay, namaste to everybody. Yes, Nagaraji kindly asked me to give a larger introduction of myself, but I'm not sure if I'm in a position to do that. And thank you also for promoting me to a professor, because you may know that in the English system, I'm not yet a full professor, but that's perhaps a minor point. So what I wanted to talk to you about and share with the audience today is just a brief outline of what's been happening in several Western countries with respect to caste. So my discussion is not really about Jaati or Varna, but just about the conception of caste, because this is the dominant terminology that we have. And so I will start with the discussion regarding the UK, because the UK is the first Western country to have any sort of legislation about caste discrimination. And this was a result of the 2010 Equality Act, in which an amendment was passed at the last minute to include a reference to caste. And the idea was to make caste an aspect of race for the purposes of that legislation. That is the main anti-discrimination law which prevails in the UK. And in 2013, there was an amendment to that very same legislation to force the government to implement that clause regarding caste, because in the original 2010 version, there was a power given to the government, but not necessarily an obligation to implement. But the 2013 amendment changed that. Now, of course, in the background, there's been a lot of activism by the different anti-caste organizations which have been gaining strength in the UK. They've also been supported by some of the organs of the United Nations. And the UK, I think, was identified as one of the spots in quite early on in the United Nations discussions in the Human Rights Forum in the United Nations in the early 2000s, where both the United Kingdom and the USA were identified as potential areas where some sort of legal activity regarding caste should be done because of the presence of an Indian diaspora. And the idea was that, wherever Indians go, they transplant their caste system and their discriminatory practices, and that these jurisdictions would be ideal to have some kind of legal activity and legislation to be passed against that. Now, in the UK, what's happened is that the legislation has still not been enacted, but in parallel, what we had was in 2014, 2015, there was a case which was pushed through the British courts, and in that case, the finding was made that the existing provision on racial discrimination, which includes reference to ethnicity, already covers caste and therefore caste discrimination. So what the government did was that because of the sort of concerns about electoral losses, the government at the time in power, which is more or less still the government in power, decided that it would not be opportune for them to see through the implementation of the caste provision, and what they would do rather is to rely on the existing case law. So if you think about the United States picture, recently we've been hearing a lot about the Cisco case, which has been at least partially dropped against the two managers in question. The UK already has its Cisco, right? And the precedent has already been set in the United Kingdom that the current equality law already can be used to undertake actions for caste discrimination claims. So that's as it stands currently. The obligation in the legislation to have caste discrimination implemented as a part of the Equality Act still exists, and nobody has made any move to remove that. Now, tomorrow, if let's say a Labour government should come into power in the United Kingdom, it's almost certain that they would start to implement that legislation. So you'd have the twin forces of the case law and the legislation. We can imagine a situation, which I will get into shortly, of the type that's taking place in California right now, right? So imagine the Cisco case had been successful from the point of view of the CRD department in California, and the legislation which is currently being proposed in California was also successful. Well, that's a likely situation that will unfold in the United Kingdom probably before very long. So the bottom line is that we have some law against caste discrimination already in the United Kingdom, and that has been now cross-read into other parts of the law where references to race appear. And so it is said that race can now include a reference to caste discrimination also, and therefore in our prosecution guidelines, which is not part of the civil law, which the Equality Act is, but the criminal law, we also have the possibility of prosecutions being mounted on the basis of caste harassment or caste-related violence. So if you think about the Indian situation, we are creeping closer to something like a caste atrocities law in the UK as well. So far, we haven't had any cases under that, but I don't put it out of question that somebody will try to formulate a kind of test case which will eventually be pushed through the courts. If you look at our existing case law in the UK, you know already about the Cisco case and the big scandal that's been unfolding in the United States regarding basically the put-up nature or the faked nature of that case. My argument has been that our British case has also been set up and it's been manufactured, and there was no real substance to the case, but nevertheless, the British judges bought the arguments and also accepted that caste is already part of the UK law. In other respects, the issues of caste also enter into the discussion. For example, I work at university, and in our university, when we get trained for diversity training, which is now common actually in both in America and in the United Kingdom, we are told that caste discrimination is unlawful and that we have to watch out. And therefore, any student or staff member of an Indian background and preferably a Hindu background or even a Brahmin background would be vulnerable to some kind of case of caste discrimination brought against them, right? And the universities, we don't know in which way they would move, but probably they wouldn't support the person against whom the complaint has been made because of the prevalent stereotypes which exist about caste and caste system. Now, I just want to move briefly to the United States, which I've been talking about already. In the United States, the action seems to have been slightly more delayed compared to the UK. And we've seen that the Cisco case already started sometime in 2010, if I'm not wrong. And the defendants have been made to suffer for something like 3 years. And finally, we hear this month that the action by the California CRD, the Civil Rights Department, has been dropped against at least the two named managers in the litigation. And one of the things that tells us, of course, is that perhaps California were about to be embarrassed regarding the strength of their case, and it seems like, as I argued already, the case was really a manufactured one. And despite the fact that extensive investigations were being made even before the case came to the courts, the California Civil Rights Department, in its former avatar as the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, decided to press on and prosecute or to conduct the civil litigation, despite all the evidence that went actually against their own case. Now, what's interesting, of course, in the Cisco situation is that the case is being dropped more or less at the same time that new proposal for legislation has been introduced in the California Senate. And so it may well be that the caste activists in the background are calculating and saying that, well, since we may have support from the California legislature to pass this legislation, which would have a much more powerful impact than an individual case, of course, that we are now in actually a better position than we would have been had the Cisco case succeeded. So from their point of view, actually things are far from over, although there is a little bit of jubilation going on the American side, on the American Hindu side, about the partial collapse of the Cisco case. But I think that's premature because the larger battle is still to be fought, and we will see what the outcome of the prospect of that legislation will be, whether it's passed or not. And it's almost definite that it will be passed because the Democrats in this California Senate have what's known as a supermajority. The California Democrats have also themselves committed to a policy against caste in their own internal rule book. So it looks as though the legislation is bound to get through, right? And of course, it remains to be seen what kind of pressure is being going to be brought against the legislators in California to prevent this legislation from taking root. But I don't see much realistic prospect of the Indian community organizations being able to stop it as yet, anyway. Beyond that, of course, we've seen the action in Seattle, and so there's been municipal legislation which has been passed in the city of Seattle. So you might say that the California legislation is sort of copycat of that, but of course the California law applies in a much wider sense to all of California jurisdiction, not just a small city like Seattle. The question now will be what other states in the United States will see fit to introduce legislation of a similar kind. The one difference that I see between the UK and the United States is the extent to which universities have become involved in the whole campaign. I think that the caste activists or the anti-caste activists have identified universities as a kind of soft target and already converted to a kind of politics of identity, and their diversity, equity, and inclusion departments have, they have a tendency to be looking out for the next available grievance to address. And so it looks as though the universities are very much prone to taking on the kind of fight that the anti-caste activists already embarked upon. And we see that the several universities across the United States, including Brown, Harvard, the California State University system, which includes 23 different colleges, they've all taken part in this larger campaign by passing their own policies against caste and caste discrimination. So this is a very interesting difference between the UK and the United States. But I suspect that, because whatever happens in the United States, eventually we get it here in the UK as well. We might get a similar sort of activism taking root in the universities here as well. Other aspect of the universities issue is, of course, the fact that a large segment of academia is already converted to the idea that Indians have oppressive and discriminatory caste system. In fact, this is what they've been teaching their students. And they've been, producing lots of academic work with respect to those sorts of claims. And so their work really sinks into the claims of the anti-caste activists. And in fact, some of the scholars, both in the United Kingdom and the United States, are themselves, you might say, they themselves are part of the activist brigade. As you see in the Cisco case, there's been several scholars who've submitted briefs to argue on behalf of the California CRD. And so they had already decided that the defendants were guilty, well before the conclusions of the proceedings. And I suppose they have a little bit of egg on their face. But as is the reality with these kinds of activist scholars or scholar activists, they rarely admit that they've actually been shown to be wrong. And so you will probably see them being very active in the California campaign from now on. All right, so this is a sort of brief review of what's been happening in the UK and the United States. Now, one of the next targets is going to be Australia. I've come to understand that in Australia already there's a review of their Racial Discrimination Act going on, and the commissioner, which is responsible for conducting the review, has already declared themselves in favor of the inclusion of caste as part of the Racial Discrimination Act. So I think we're going to see some of the same kinds of movements in Australia. And as with the other places, there is a strong participation of scholars in the discussion who are more or less all pro the inclusion of caste in the anti-discrimination law. So some very interesting developments which don't augur well for the well-being of Hindus or Indians at large in these countries. Now, I was going to show you a PowerPoint slide which connects the activist NGOs with the United Nations human rights organizations, with the academics and the respective governments in these countries. But I think it's without the visuals, it's difficult to get the strength of the claims across. But basically the claim is that there is a kind of ecosystem of caste activism which has been working at international level and also at a variety of domestic national levels. There is a strong coordination between these, and in fact, very often.
Can you share that with email letters with us? We can share it.
Oh yes, of course, I will do that. Yeah. Shall I do it right now? Yeah,
please do that. But by the time you complete your talk, we can share.
All right. Okay. Just 1 second. Yeah, I will try to get it to you. Yes. So the basic claim is that there is this sort of strong coordination which is going on there, and sooner or later, it's the sort of blanket effect of that is going to be quite wide. My belief, which is not just my belief, but several people that I've been working with at least on the UK front, is that the coordination is also ultimately aimed at trying to push for similar type of legislation in India. Now, India is an interesting case because in many respects, the Indian legal situation and the Indian discourse has not really been very helpful. And of course, part of what we are suffering in these Western countries is an importation of the kind of toxic identity politics which has already been brewing for something like 50 years in the Indian context. And so what we are getting is a kind of outflow of that together with the diaspora population. As we know from within the Indian communities themselves, many people do support the laws on caste discrimination, right? And some of them are, become great spokespeople for the legislation, and many of the academics are also coming from India, right? So it's not as though India is really absent from these kinds of issues. But the other striking thing is that no serious answer is coming from India with respect to these problems. As a matter of fact, when you look at the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the representations that India has been making to that committee, and this is for a long time. I mean, this is since the creation of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in the 1960s. Although India has always claimed that caste is not covered by the convention. And that's a point of view with which the committee which supervises the convention differs. India has always sent very, very detailed reports to the committee with respect to its very elaborate structure, legal structures and policy structures with respect to the fight against caste discrimination within India. So in some ways, Indians have been trying to be very goody-goodies in the international arena and trying to say, look, we are doing so much against caste discrimination. But the problem is that underlying that kind of posture is the acceptance of the colonial idea that India has a caste system, it's oppressive, and so on and so forth. I think you've heard discussions about that already. So this colonial or Christian idea of the caste system is so deeply entrenched in the Indian discourse that there seems to be no way of getting out of it, right? From the reservation system to the caste atrocities legislation to the reservations which apply to electoral seats and so on and so forth, right? No government can really be seen to be upsetting the orthodoxies which have already taken root in those arenas. And so what we get instead is the kind of toxicity of the debate which has already been developed in India, and it spreads into the areas where Indians live abroad, unfortunately. Sorry, I will just comply with the request to share it. I'm not really sure what's the best way of sharing it. Just one second. Just bear with me a second. Harichi, if I send it to you, is it okay?
Yes, please.
Because your email came up conveniently first, so just bear with me. My apologies for being so incompetent. I know I'm probably in a crowd of people who are very accomplished techies. Okay, done. So it should be on the way to you, hopefully. Okay, so I think I will stop there, and I'm happy to field any questions if there's still time for that.
One question from Professor Vidyasagar, Mathumal Vidyasagar. He wants to know that the legislations in these countries might ultimately result in the dropping of the cases at the end, but prosecution itself might ruin the lives of those who are petitioned against. So
yes,
probably
right.
that is the idea behind filing these cases.
Yes, we should bear in mind that prosecution is probably a looser term in this context, because most of the legislation that we're talking about is actually civil law legislation. It's sort of some kind of statutory tort-based legislation. This is the nature of the anti-discrimination laws in the Anglo-American jurisdictions, which includes Australia as well. So they are civil law actions. And this is the kind of thing that Shashi Tharoor wants to introduce in India. He has already prepared, in collaboration with an academic in Oxford University, a kind of draft of or a mirror which mirrors the British equality legislation, and they want to have it implemented in India. And one of the things that, of course, that legislation contains is a reference to caste discrimination. And it even extends to, being vegetarian, and insistence on being vegetarian as an aspect of caste or indicative of caste discrimination. But the larger point is well taken that, yes, of course, people can be dragged through courts. This is exactly what's happened in the Cisco case, although the prosecution has been dropped after 3 years or so. You see that the defendants have suffered greatly. And if I suppose the one positive outcome is that defendants now feel as though they have a dog in the fight, and they really committed to fighting this kind of nonsense because they've become direct victims of it. Hariji, I don't know who is.
Next slide.
You can continue to the last but one slide. So, but next one, that one. That's the slide. One before, yeah. This is the slide which sort of tries to get across the collusion between the different arms of this anti-caste activism, which is happening at a global level. So you can almost kind of see the connections here, right? So if you look at the part between the activist NGOs and the United Nations human rights organizations, you see that I've specifically put the IDSN, which is the International Dalit Solidarity Network. And one of the interesting things is that India has been vetoing consultative status for the IDSN up to this year. And what I discovered earlier this year is that the UK and the US have been maneuvering to gain consultative status for this organization, which they've managed to do so successfully. So they used a kind of procedure, a voting procedure, which went around the Indian objections to secure the entry of the IDSN. Now, the interesting thing about the IDSN is that it's also funded by several European governments and several churches from different European countries. So, you can see who is sort of trying to set the international agenda on the on this international anti-caste activism, and they have a great deal of influence in the United Nations human rights organizations, even before they were admitted to consultative status. If you look at, I'm just thinking about one of the reports of the Special Rapporteur on Minorities a few years ago, I think 2016. She heavily footnoted the reports of the IDSN in her submission on caste and caste discrimination. So this is the kind of collusion that's been going on. If you move to the to the right-hand side, the top right-hand side, you see that I've listed the special rapporteurs and the committees. Now, that's to indicate that there is a kind of interaction between the United Nations human rights organs and the academics, because the special rapporteurs, an example of which I just gave, often tend to be academics, and the committees are also staffed by, often staffed by former academics. So there's a kind of collusion there. But of course, academics, as I've already mentioned earlier on in the presentation, play a big role as anti-caste activists anyway. And they've been trying to influence the agenda in the UK, in the United States, and this will continue to happen in Australia and other countries as well, also with respect to India. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you see a kind of collusion between the academics and the governments. And here I have, the Cisco case I already mentioned as an example, where academics actually took to submitting briefs against the defendants as though they had already decided that the defendants were guilty. And this is an obscene sort of intervention that they can make, because it shows that the academics have no respect for the legal process, right? They don't wait for the conclusion of the legal process to say that the defendants are guilty. But they want to add their opinion about their guilt in the briefs that they're submitting to the court litigation. So it's a very appalling sort of kind of situation. On the bottom left-hand side, you see the activist NGOs working quite closely with governments, and certainly our experience in the UK showed that the government organs were very, very receptive to the claims of the anti-caste activist organizations, the NGOs, whereas when it came to accepting briefs from us and submissions from us as in the opposing side, they tended to make life pretty difficult for us and acted as though the case had already been made, and that we were expected to kind of climb a mountain of evidence before we could say that the case for legislation is without foundation. I just want to conclude by saying that one of the things that you see across the board is a very, very serious lack of evidence. If you look at Seattle, for example, if you look at the Cisco case and also the legislation which is pending now in the California Senate, if you look at the British case law, if you look at the legislation in Britain, if one scrutinizes the level of evidence closely, you see that there is nothing that the anti-caste activists have. and yet they've been so successful in making their case. Now, this is a remarkable state of affairs, because if you had any other type of legislation, you would have thought, actually, we need to have some kind of evidence base for passing this legislation, to be able to justify that this legislation should exist. Not so in the case of caste discrimination, right? And one has to ask very, very big questions about how and why this is being allowed, right? Now, of course, partly we can turn the scrutiny to ourselves and say, well, why are we allowing this? Why have we been so ineffective in addressing and countering these kinds of maneuverings, right? So I'll just leave you with that thought. I don't know if there are any other questions.
Yeah, if there are any more questions, we'll take them up in the end.